today. Our interpreters are Mike Rizzolo and Terry Johnson, and Liza Orr will be reverse interpreting down in the audience. We have also with us Linda Miller, our stenotypist, so that you can view today on what we call the big picture machine, the lecture that will be given by our good friend Peter Jennings. This is a way of offering to you Peter Jennings as though he were on his television set with his 6:30 news. We welcome back to NTID a very good friend and one that we call a folk hero among deaf because of the wonderful captioning of his TV news every day. Peter, come forth and be our guest again.
Could we turn the house lights up for just a moment? Is that possible? Because since I was here last year, I got contact lenses, and now I can see you. Wonderful. To those of you in the hall and outside, thank you very much for having me back. It is, since I last saw you, I have had to make a number of speeches in various parts of the country. And I must tell you, this is the only one that I look forward to. I must also tell you, it is not easy to get to Rochester. Last year, some of you will remember, we started off and the airline canceled and we got a helicopter to go somewhere. Today I had to drive to Morristown, New Jersey, which took an hour and 45 minutes. I could have driven to Rochester. But we are here and I am grateful. I feel very much as if I'm coming back to family. And I guess that's why I'm so glad to be here. And I've also taken the liberty, and I hope you don't mind, of bringing a member of my family with me, my mother, who has been visiting her grandchildren in New York City, so I brought her to meet you today as well. It's nice to see Julie Cameron again, and Uncle Bill, who I see is dressing, as I said, more conservatively this year. And I want to thank in advance Mike and Terry and Liza. I was reminiscing with Mike or Terry, I can't remember which one it was, as to whether the jokes last year were bad or signed badly. Another reason I'm glad to be here is because, quite frankly, as I guess you probably sense, national journalists like myself are not welcome everywhere in the country. I was talking to a colleague the other day about a situation in which a journalist and a diplomat and a politician were traveling together. And they came to a small town and a small inn and checked in for the night, but there were only 2 beds. And the diplomat, being a diplomat, said, well, don't worry, there's a stable just outside, and I will go and sleep in the stable. And off he went, and a short while later there was a knock at the door, and the diplomat came back into the inn and said, I'm terribly sorry, but there's a cow in the stable, and I'm allergic to cows. Well, the politician said, well, don't worry about it, I'll sleep in the stable. And off went the politician to sleep in the stable. Journalist, the diplomat went to sleep. A short while later there was a knock at the door, and it was the politician saying, I'm very embarrassed, but there's also a goat in the stable, and I'm allergic to goats. Well, I must tell you, journalists do not like to give up their beds. This one reluctantly said, all right, I'll go sleep in the stable. And off he went, and a short while later, after the diplomat and the politician had gone to sleep, there was a knock on the door. They opened the door, and it was the pig. I know you have a lot of questions. And so I think what I'd like to do today is a little different from last year. One of the nice things about feeling so comfortable about coming back to see you is I don't have to write a speech. So what I'm going to do is wander around over a variety of subjects and events of the last year, if that's okay with you, and then try to answer your questions. I also remember from last year that some of you were somewhat reluctant at the beginning to get up and ask questions. I hope you will not be so reluctant this year. I want to talk a little bit about some of the places I've been in the last year, some of the developments in the country. I'm glad to see you are still watching World News Tonight. I wish you had a Nielsen box among you. Our ratings might be better. Let's start with politics for a second. We're beginning to get quite interested in national politics now. And I guess by looking at the news and reading the newspaper, you are beginning to sense that candidates are coming forward. Gary Hart is the front runner at the moment, largely because nobody else has declared, and he was the front runner last time. It's quite a change for Gary this year, because you recall in the 1984 campaign, people kept saying, Gary who? Gary who? That was only his family. Now, things are getting better for him. I was in Washington the other night at a dinner where Senator Kennedy was the speaker. And as you know, he has said that he's not going to run. You can never trust a Kennedy altogether when he says that. But he was actually reminiscing about how there were parts of the country where he was quite surprised that a Kennedy was welcome. He told this wonderful story about being in Virginia, across the Potomac from Washington, and being in an audience about this size, and just as he began to speak, somebody up in the middle of the audience got up and began to heckle him, and he called him a horse's rear end. I'm paraphrasing. And everybody in the audience jumped on the heckler, and they got him out of the room very quickly. And Kennedy turned to his host and said, I'm really very impressed. I didn't know this was Kennedy country. And his host said, it isn't, it's horse country. Jesse Helms, of course, is still a big political figure in our lives. He tried to buy Dan Rather, unsuccessfully. He, in many ways, is going to represent in this political campaign the very, very conservative element in American politics. He is so conservative, in fact, that he is against nude bathing in North Carolina because he thinks it will lead to dancing. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was looking, coming up this morning, at an article I had to write for the Encyclopedia Americana. Every year now, for 5 years, the Encyclopedia has very kindly asked me if I would write what is really a year in review essay, which they put at the beginning of every year's new volume for the Encyclopedia. And one of the things that staggers me all the time is how much transpires in our world that affects us in the course of a year. When I was trying to go back, I think it's 15 months, isn't it, Julie? About 14 or 15 months since I was here the last time. And I began to tick off this morning some of the things that had happened which affected you and affected me in those months. There was the earthquake in Mexico, to which I rushed off one Saturday night, and Julie was telling me this morning that some of you were fascinated by that. I can tell you no more fascinated than were we. You may have seen us standing outside the Juarez Hospital late into the night as those incredibly dedicated rescue workers worked to save what came to be known as the miracle babies. It was a devastating jolt to Mexico, not only in terms of the physical damage and the death, but in terms of the morale of the country, which depends to such a large extent on tourism. It takes that kind of an event, however, to make reporters, who are not, quite frankly, as cynical as we're said to be, realize how strong the human spirit is when faced with absolute catastrophe. In those hospitals and under all those buildings, people, as you know, lived for many, many days. I went back during that period and looked at the statistics, there was actually an earthquake in Romania at one point where somebody had lived for 60 days under the rubble because they had access for workers. In this particular earthquake, we all learned something. We've had a small earthquake, as you know, in California the other day along the San Andreas fault line again. And the great thing I think that probably came out of Mexico City, aside from this demonstration of courage, was a real need for and a realization that there is a need for international cooperation in times of disaster in an era when international cooperation isn't always not at its best. We would have, just at the Juarez Hospital alone, for example, a French team digging from the top and a Swiss team digging from the side, and the Mexicans, who were very frustrated and wanted to be in charge, understandably to some extent, deciding that they would dynamite in order to get the rubble out of the way so that they could go on and pay attention to the living people outside. There were tremendously dedicated teams who came from Dade County in Florida, from American fire departments, all of whom had a different view of how you should go about trying to save the perhaps living people in an earthquake. It was really the Swiss and the French and the Americans who, thank goodness, prevailed. Because if they had not, the dogs would not have been sent time and time again into the rubble to look for people who, as we discovered in Mexico, as we've discovered in other earthquakes, can live for a considerable period of time. One of the reasons, those of you who are interested in the babies, that the babies lived so long was because in a couple of cases they had literally just come from their mother's womb. They knew no sense of fear. They were in the dark where they had been prior to their birth. But it was an extraordinary moment to see those people carried from that hospital. And we all learned something. The next time there is an earthquake of such enormous proportions, and there will undoubtedly be one, the world community, the world earthquake experts, are going to work better together because of international cooperation and not simply dedication. I must tell you, I've actually been in an earthquake. In fact, I've been in a couple, but I was right in the middle of an earthquake once in southern Tehran, southern Iran, I should say. And there's nothing more terrifying. It's literally like standing in the middle of a bowl full of jelly and having no sense whatsoever of any control over your own body. 1985, I think, probably will be remembered best as the year of terrorism. I'm going to come to that in a second, but thought you might like to hear a little bit about the trip to the Soviet Union. I didn't spend all of it in bed or in the hospital, though I was terribly sick. I do have to say, however, it was an American flu, which was not helped by the cold weather in Moscow. Our Soviet trip really began out of the meeting of Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev in Geneva. When Mr. Gorbachev came to power as the General Secretary of the Communist Party, because he was so young, 52 years old, and because he appeared very much to represent at least a new generation of Soviet leaders, we began to track his career as closely as we could. And so some of you may recall we went to Paris and did the program in Paris when he paid his first visit to the West to see François Mitterrand, the French president. And then there was the meeting in Geneva, 2 heads of state, 17,000 journalists, and no news. And then we went to Moscow. The Soviet Union continues to be 2 things, I think, for us in this country. One, which is why I think we should be so interested, our principal adversary, an adversary which we must understand, because to not understand one another simply enhances and may even increase the risks of war by accident or miscalculation. And also in and of themselves, one of the most fascinating peoples, plural, in the world. Try to give you some example of how big the Soviet Union is. On the last night I was in Moscow, I was having dinner with a Soviet Jewish refusenik, that is to say, a Russian Jew who had applied to emigrate to Israel, who had been refused, who had been a very well-known and famous international concert pianist. And the moment he applied to leave the country, his career inside the Soviet Union took a very big fall. He was not allowed to play the piano in Moscow or in Leningrad, the two major cities in the Soviet Union, and particularly the two major cultural cities. And the last night I was there, we had dinner. He was going to the eastern side of the Soviet Union to play a concert. 10 time zones away. We've got 5. 10 time zones away. 7 hours by plane to fly from Moscow to the other side of the Soviet Union. That'll give you some sense of the enormous size of the country. The dominant political power in terms of culture in the Soviet Union continued to be the Russians. They, however, are being pressed from all over the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by all of the other republics with their own national desires, their national commitments, and their national programs in terms of influence. One of the great challenges for Mr. Gorbachev, and you may have seen a little bit of it at the 27th Party Congress, which took us to Moscow, is this need to address this particular problem. People of your age in the Soviet Union have come to the awareness in very large measure that their goals and their dreams are very often unrealized. Julie's baby, kibitzing in the background. Don't go away, Julie. One of the problems for Mr. Gorbachev is to meet the aspirations of people of your age. It is very difficult to do so in a time of international conflict, when the Soviets feel, as President Reagan has felt in this country, there is such a need to give so much money to defense. Mr. Gorbachev comes to power actually quite popular in the Soviet Union. A man who, in many respects, has taken some leaves from President Reagan's book. He uses television a lot. He presses the flesh, very much like American politicians do. He goes out and he mixes with the Soviet people, which previous leaders never did before. He has had some experience in the West. That is to say, he has been in Western Europe, he has worked elsewhere in the socialist bloc, he has visited Canada when he was the minister in charge of agriculture. And the Soviet people that we talked to, and the Soviet people that other reporters talked to who traveled much more extensively in the Soviet Union than I did, is that there is a real sense of things possibly could be better. In all fairness, I must tell you that things look better in Moscow alone than when I had been there 4 years previously. Soviets, by and large, look on life very differently than we do. As you know, and I know so well, two of the things, for example, that we prize so highly in this country are the right to speak freely whenever and wherever we want to. You cannot do that in the Soviet Union. And the right to travel freely. While there are a great many Soviets who believe in a pluralist society and a democratic society, and there are an infinite number who would like the opportunity to speak freely whenever they can, and there are perhaps a lesser number who would like to have the freedom to travel to the West when they can. One of the things that has to be acknowledged about the Soviet Union is that since the Russian Revolution 70 plus years ago, things have got better for every generation. Housing is better, education is better, food is better. And while these are not the measures on any given yardstick that we would use as our prime ideological measure of how well you do in life, things are getting better. I think that something worth bearing in mind as you go on with your studies is trying to get as much appreciation as you can of the adversary, as I call it. to read as much as you can about the Soviet Union for some fairly simple reasons. A lot of people in the country, and sometimes myself included, believe that our government's attitude towards the rest of the world is not always well-intentioned and well-educated. If those of you who are going to exercise your voting right actively, and I hope that is all of you, are better informed about the principal adversary that this country has, then the chances are you're going to elect a representative, congressman, or a senator in that neck of the woods where you live who's going to be better educated on the subject and is going to pressure Congress and the administration to come up in many cases with better policies. The Reagan administration continues to see the Soviet hand behind all kinds of trouble in all parts of the world. I would argue, and perhaps we can talk about it a little during question time, that you can only really blame the Soviets for so much. You cannot blame them for the present crisis we have in the oil market, which doesn't look like a crisis for us on the surface of things because gasoline is getting so much cheaper, but is a crisis for those countries to which we've lent enormous sums of money and who may default on their loans to American banks. You cannot blame the Soviet Union, I don't believe, for all of the trouble in Central America, and we can talk about Central America, Nicaragua, and the countries if you wish. You cannot blame the Soviet Union for the poverty, or all of the poverty in the developing world, which very often leads to an advantage for opportunists, socialists and communists particularly, who will use that desperation in the developing world to advance their own political causes. And I don't think you can blame the Soviet Union entirely for the failure of the two large countries, the two superpowers at the moment, to get together on the question of arms control. There is heartening news in the last couple of days about Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan's next summit meeting. They had a pretty good summit in Geneva. They sat around the fire, snoozed together, but did manage, as I think you will recall and perhaps even felt, to reduce tension quite significantly in the world for a limited period of time. That's the great advantage of having, I would argue, regular summit meetings, so that you reduce the chance of miscalculation. Now, Mr. Gorbachev, as you will recall, has spent much of the time since Geneva saying they really didn't want to have another summit unless there was some practical agreement they could come to on the question of arms control. The arms control talks in Geneva have not gone very well. Mr. Reagan, who has not got, to put it carefully, a passion for arms control if it comes at what he regards as the expense of the American military strength, has not been responding. Now Mr. Gorbachev appears to be coming around a bit and saying, well, we'll have a summit meeting anyway, because he and clearly the Reagan administration see some value in keeping the dialogue going at such a high level, I think in part because they saw the generally good feeling that existed after Geneva and have seen it also go away. Soviets are very suspicious people, very suspicious people. There's a famous prison in Moscow called the Lubyanka, which I'm sure you've read about in spy novels. And there were three men sitting in the Lubyanka prison. They hardly talked to each other at all. And finally one works up the courage to turn to another and say, "Why are you here?" And he said, "I criticized Popov in '69. "Why are you here?" He said, "I praised Popov in '70. They finally work up the courage to ask the third man, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm Popov." One of the places that the Reagan administration and a great many other Americans see the Soviet hand is in Libya. If you watched the news last night, you will probably have some sense today that it looks as if the Reagan administration is going to take another shot in some form or other at Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. I said that 1985 was the year of international terrorism. Let's go back a bit and work our way back towards Gaddafi. How many of you, I suspect many of you, remember the drama on board TWA Flight 847 in Beirut Airport, when 40 Americans were held captive by Shiites, those Muslims very much from the lower class in Lebanon who had wanted freedom, released from prison of their comrades who were being held south of the Lebanese-Israeli border in Israeli prisons. I'm slightly embarrassed to tell you, but I'm afraid that it's something of a reality of mid-20th century life, that television particularly, but television and the press in general, got used somewhat by the terrorists. One of the reasons I think that happens is because we in this country place enormous value on the individual life in jeopardy. And so those 39 or 40 Americans on 847 in Beirut just became vital, as we saw, to the whole country. Most calculated terrorist actions such as this have ended, believe it or not, peacefully for Americans. And I was looking at some statistics the other day which show that despite the great fervor in the country about terrorism as a result of TWA Flight 840 the other day, the attack on the discotheque in Berlin, various attacks that have occurred in France, there's an attack in the Cameroons, there's an attack in Athens the other day, that Americans actually are less of a target internationally today than we were in 1976. I think that's a little hard to swallow given the fact that all of the attention is on terrorism and America. Many people ask me, because I lived in the Middle East for so long, why the terrorists pick on Americans. The ironic thing is that they are not picking on Americans individually. I know that doesn't make much sense when you think of what happened to Leon Klinghoffer, who was pushed over the side of the Achille Lauro. But there is a deep and unabating anger which exists in many parts of the developing world, but particularly in the Arab world, for the image of America which supports the country so wholeheartedly, which they regard as their enemy, which is obviously Israel. The Reagan administration has decided that one of the ways to get back at terrorism is by force. I'm puzzled by this to some extent. I had lunch in New York the other day with the Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, right after TWA Flight 840 had been damaged by the bomb, and 4 people, as you know, lost their lives. The very first question I asked him was, do you think that this was Colonel Gaddafi and the Libyans? Remember, this was also after the Gulf of Sidra. His reaction, much to my surprise, was absolutely not. But he thought American action in the Gulf of Sidra had really made Colonel Gaddafi keep his head down. The trouble is that over a long period of time, Colonel Gaddafi, who sees himself in an ideal world, I'm never quite sure what kind of a world he really lives in, sees himself as an ideal world, as the leader of some world revolution in which the downtrodden of the world, as seen by him and by many other people in the world, will ultimately bring down the capitalist, industrialized societies which they regard as keeping the boot on their neck. And so over a long period of time, Colonel Gaddafi has funded and given support to various organizations who around the world at given times have indulged in acts of terrorism. I remember being in the southern Philippines 13 years ago and going all the way down to the south of the Philippine archipelago to meet Moro Muslims, Muslim rebels who were then fighting against the government of President Marcos, who were 13 years ago funded in part by Colonel Gaddafi. Now, last night, the administration says that they've got direct information, which we monitored, if you watched John McWethy on the news last night, between Tripoli in Libya and the Libyan embassy in East Berlin, that there's a direct connection to the Berlin discotheque. I'm inclined to think, without altogether contradicting the administration, that what we are seeing in the world are all of these various organizations, and there are scores of them, who will take advantage of the moment to attack an American installation an American aircraft. As you've noticed, not very often individual Americans, except perhaps in Salvador, where the 4 Marines, you'll recall, in a cafe were gone after directly, and who will strike out even at that moment Colonel Gaddafi had wished them not to. The thing we have to remember about Gaddafi, I think, is that he probably doesn't have much control over a great many people in the world who are operating in part with his funds. So the Reagan administration decides that it's going to go after Colonel Gaddafi, and I would not be the slightest bit surprised to see probably not the Sixth Fleet back in the Gulf of Sidra again, and if it goes back, we'll know about it. It's at the moment at the other side of the Mediterranean. But some other kind of action, because the President's advisors have come to the conclusion that you can point a finger at a particular individual and blame him for worldwide terrorism. You'll recall not very long ago, a number of people in this country were pointing their finger directly at the Soviet Union as the director of a terror network. I must tell you, I don't agree. If you had spent any time in Lebanon, where I spent 6 both happy and miserable years, you would realize very quickly that you don't need a Colonel Gaddafi to play off the dissatisfaction of people who have always lived at the lower end of the economic, social, and political scale. You do not need a Gaddafi, nor, I would argue, even an Ayatollah Khomeini, to inspire Shiite Muslims, who, as I said, were socially at the bottom of the Muslim scale, to try now to extend the Iranian Revolution that cost us our diplomats for 440 days across the Middle East, if they sense they now finally, after centuries, not just generations, have that power. And so as you hear about terrorism, and you hear people in this country, or in any country for that matter, saying the way to get at terrorists is simply by attacking them back, bear in mind a couple of things. When the American embassy was bombed in Beirut, when the Marine compound was bombed in Beirut, when the Justice Ministry in, I want to say Nicaragua, but it's not, in Colombia, no, that's not right either, I'll come back to it, when the Marines were attacked in El Salvador, President Reagan, who's been very pragmatic on the subject, has always said we will attack when we know an address. And it has been virtually impossible for us, with all of our intelligence capabilities, to put an actual address on the people who did the terror. I don't know about you, but I found it quite extraordinary to see the Italians name May Ilyas Mansour, the woman on TWA 840, as the suspect. And I thought to myself, my God, what progress we've made. They've put a name on somebody. And then, as you probably saw a couple of days ago, she turns up in Tripoli, which is a northern city in Lebanon, as well as the capital of Libya, saying she didn't do it, and she's going to sue anybody who says she did. It points up how very difficult it is to fight force with force if you are as big and powerful a country as we are. There are people in this country, as there were during Vietnam, who think we should bomb Libya back to the Stone Age. Trouble is, Libya isn't too far beyond the Stone Age at the moment. And assassinating Colonel Gaddafi, which some people think is a very good idea, might simply bring a more dangerous figure in his wake. What I think we've got to realize in the country is, and here's in a sense where oil will make a little more sense to you at the moment in terms of all you're reading and hearing about in terms of plummeting oil prices, is that the world is divided not only east and west but north and south. And the problems in the southern, the less developed countries of the world, what's sometimes called the third world or the developing world, are as dangerous to political stability and as dangerous to our future international political well-being as the Soviet Union is, including the possibility that anger and hatred and the desire for political power in the developing world will lead to someone taking advantage of nuclear proliferation. I fear not, personally, that the bomb will be dropped by the Soviet Union. I do fear that with the capability of getting the knowledge of how to build a bomb out of a textbook at Yale University or Princeton or any other good university campus in the country will lead some mad man somewhere at some point to use a nuclear weapon. And that's the reason why the driving force in this country and every other industrial and other civilized country, there should be a driving demand to stop nuclear proliferation. So when you hear about Libya and read about Libya on the television in the next few weeks, do what I hope you've already done. Take with a grain of salt everything that we are saying. In fact, take with a grain of salt almost everything we say. Let me talk for just a minute about the Philippines. I want to tell you what a really smart reporter I am. When the revolution came in the Philippines, I was in Moscow, having just been to the Filipino election, pretty convinced that the election was fixed. Wasn't much doubt about that, though not many reporters or not many American observers, quite frankly, got very far out into the countryside. And where we saw it was fixed was largely in one neighborhood in Manila, where it was not only fixed, but it was right around the corner. And so we all rushed off to watch people stuffing ballot boxes and people pushing other people around and throwing chairs at one another if they didn't like the results. But I left Manila just a few days after the election, absolutely convinced that President Marcos was back in power to stay, that Mrs. Aquino had been cheated of the election, and went to Moscow and was on the plane to Moscow, in fact, when I heard that the revolution had occurred. So anything I say on the Philippines is also suspect. The tendency here has been to concentrate on the Marcoses and the Marcos millions, or more specifically on the Marcos shoes. I don't know if you heard President Marcos talking to Ted Koppel the other night down in Hawaii, but I kind of thought President Marcos gave a fairly decent answer. Those are 20 years of shoes. She never throws anything out. I think probably our attention should be really directed more to the new government of Mrs. Aquino and to the future of the American relationship with the Philippines. One of the reasons that those two enormous bases at Clark Air Base and Subic, the naval base, are so important to us is not that we couldn't put them elsewhere. We could put them elsewhere. We could put them in Thailand, we could put them in Indonesia, they could go to Japan, they could go elsewhere to American-controlled islands in the Pacific. But what all those other places don't have is the ideal combination excuse me, that the Philippines has, which is a workforce which works cheap, which speaks English, and which has had, of course, a very long relationship with the United States. There were for many, many years, remember the Philippines was our one and only colony. There were for many, many generations, many, many years, not generations, many years, Filipinos who were so pro-American that they really almost wanted to be Mexico. Not sure anybody wanted to be Mexico today, given the problems it has. But that has begun to change a little, not just because of the anti-government, sometimes communist revolution and rebellion in the South and a little bit in the North, but because of the continuous, ongoing, unquestioning support that we in this country gave for President Marcos while he was in power, all during the time that he had imposed martial law. Mrs. Aquino, however, comes from the same kind of social background. Her husband, who you've heard a lot about, Benigno Aquino, who was assassinated, which in a sense led to this revolution, was at one point in his political career almost interchangeable with Marcos in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their political apparatuses. They are intermarried in many cases, these families. Mrs. Aquino comes to power almost as a mystic, as someone who Filipinos themselves can hardly believe is there, but she faces all of the same problems. How many of you saw the news last night? I don't want to be, a couple of you. It's not good enough. We had a piece from Manila last night done by Mike Lee, which was fascinating in that it reminded many of us who hadn't thought about it for some period of time that the three fruit companies, Del Monte, I've forgotten the other two at the moment, United Brands and one other, are almost the total controllers of the Filipino banana and pineapple industry. In a changing political situation, rather as I was talking about elsewhere in the world, the United States is seen in one part as a benign and good employer, which offers in many cases extensive services to its Filipino employees, but also representative to some extent of large, landowning, exploiting representatives of a former government at a time when Filipinos are really feeling their oats, at a time when Filipinos, particularly who live on the land and who are particularly poor, now feel that with Mrs. Aquino they have a new chance in life for land reform and for some opportunity to have a say which they've never had before in their own destinies. That seed which is germinating in the Filipino mind means problems for the United States if we do not understand them. The air bases represent to opposition Filipinos a kind of occupation. On the government side, they represent enormous employment. We pay a considerable amount of money for those bases. The contracts for those bases will be renegotiated again in 1990, and I don't doubt for a second they will be renewed. But again, as you read the papers and as you watch television, the Marcos shoes are kind of a fun story, and however many black bras she had, and the paper chase after the Marcos millions, and the jokes about Marcos. It's too bad he lost the Philippines, now the only island he owns is Manhattan, are fun, though kind of bitter fun. But where our eyes should all be cast is in the direction of the Philippines themselves. Talk a little bit about the ramifications of the Philippines elsewhere. In countries like Korea and in Chile, a very strong message has been sent by the Reagan administration, which is that if you are a right-wing dictator prepared to use a very heavy hand with your population, that does not necessarily mean you're going to get support from the Reagan administration any longer. There was a long period of time when people like the Shah, President Marcos, Chun Doo-hwan in Korea and elsewhere, where strongmen, Pinochet in Chile, where strongmen around the world felt that they could get away with a great deal if they were allies of the United States. You may have seen or read how nervous they are now in Korea. You may have seen and read how nervous they are now in Korea. And we know, of course, what happened to the Shah. We know what happened to Panama. There is, I think, a changing mood around the world in terms of what people think they can get from what is essentially a conservative, though middle-of-the-road conservative administration in this country. I want to stop and look at my watch for a second. Probably enough, and probably more of this will come as I attempt to answer your questions. Let me talk just very briefly about South Africa, because I get the impression, looking at campuses around the country, that South Africa is a big problem for young people. The Reagan administration, as somebody reminded me this morning, faces a very serious dilemma in South Africa, because once again in South Africa, as it was in Rhodesia, you'll recall, which is now Zimbabwe, the danger is that we end up through a transitional stage as being on the other side to the angels, i.e. in Southern Africa, on the wrong side of a black revolution, which is bound at some point to be successful. I sat with a black South African the other night who had been imprisoned on Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela is held. This fellow had been there for 8 years, and somebody across the table, like so many Americans, said, well, give me the timetable for the revolution. And this fellow smiled, because only Americans want timetables for revolutions. And he said, I don't think it'll be in the next decade or two. And I said to him rather quietly, I said, were you being optimistic? Because if anybody had asked me that question, I would have said the chances of a real black revolution in South Africa are perhaps not in my lifetime. And he said, yes, I'm afraid. He was a man in his late 30s, early 40s. And he said, yes, I'm afraid to admit that is the case, but I don't think it's very helpful to say it in public. But here was a leading dissident in South Africa who believed that given the present scheme of things, that the white minority government in South Africa could remain in power into the indefinite future. It's a real problem for the United States. If we impose on South Africa the sense of values that we have and learned to an even more pertinent extent during the Civil Rights Revolution in this country 20 years ago, then we will be much more vigorously, or should be much more vigorously and much more openly on the side of the forces for change in South Africa. To repeat myself slightly, as somebody reminded himself, however, there are forces in this country, and in many cases legitimate forces, who believe that South Africa is strategically important to the United States in terms of worldwide competition with the Soviet Union, and there are also still in that country, among other things, many minerals which people in the free world cannot presently get elsewhere. I don't know how you feel on this campus, but I hope you will tell me. I'm one who's inclined to believe we have to be much more vigorous on the side of change. I know and like and respect on a one-to-one basis many Afrikaners, but I don't think they're going to change without being pushed. So there are some of the stories. Terrorism, East-West relations, Philippines, which is all part of East-West, and us, the industrialized country in the developing world, and which way we want to go. It is not, I suspect, going to be an easy last half to the decade. And in the 1990s, if I read it correctly, and we all get nice and lazy about saving energy because we've got free oil and free gas, all of these problems, including the price of oil, are going to come rising back up, I think, and slap us in the face again in the 1990s. But I mentioned pushing the South Africans around. Now, why don't you push me around? And having talked for 40 minutes, or wandered for 40 minutes, I think is more accurate, why don't you get it going by asking some questions? Who's going to be the first? Yes? I think if there is any serious chance that Colonel Gaddafi is going to be overthrown, it is likely to come from inside, not from outside. It could indeed be from within his own army. It could be from within his own security apparatus, which is propped up primarily by the East Germans. It could be, if the United States and Libya continue to scrap with one another, the Soviet Union, which is, if not an ally of Libya, at least an uncomfortable bedfellow, that they will get fed up with Gaddafi and engineer his overthrow. I personally don't think we can encourage his overthrow. In fact, I think by taking on Colonel Gaddafi in such a public way, we almost strengthen his hand. And we oblige other people, such as some of the more moderate nations in the Arab world, to give public lip service and support to Colonel Gaddafi, where they find him even more troublesome than we do. So in a phrase to answer your question, I think if Colonel Gaddafi is overthrown, it will come, as it has always come in Libya, from inside, not from outside. And I don't see much value in assassinating him. Aside from anything else, it's not the kind of ethical conduct we want this country to be associated with. Yes, ma'am. You were taking note of the fact that I was originally a radio reporter, and looking back on how do I feel about radio? Looking back now, radio seems very civilized compared to television. My mother, who is here, once came to visit me in the London bureau when I was at ABC in London, and I introduced her to everybody in television. And then I introduced her to the local radio correspondent, Bob Dyke, who was the first man into Iran for ABC. And my mother said in a loud voice, "Yes, my husband always told me radio was much more serious." Everybody in television was very embarrassed. I loved radio and still do a daily radio program. One of the reasons I like radio, I guess, is because it, in some respect, is much more of a challenge for the broadcaster's mind than television. In television, we have all the pictures and we have all the graphics. Radio is a challenge to your own mind because you've got to communicate without pictures. I think for those of you who do not listen to radio, to commercial radio in America, you ain't missing too much. Most of it's junk, personal opinion. But as someone who worked my way up through radio and television, if up is the right phrase, I don't think I could have done television as comfortably without having first done radio. Yes, sir. Can you speak up just a touch? Space shot, my God, Challenger. I apologize. Actually, I don't apologize. I'm just glad you brought it up. Challenger was captioned. The day-long coverage of Challenger was captioned. Somebody say yes or no. It was. I'll tell you first, on a personal note, I think it's the longest, hardest day I ever spent on television. 7 hours. I was having lunch at the White House when we got the news, because the president was going to give the State of the Union speech that night, and Don Regan came into the room and handed us a piece of paper saying, "Shuttle has exploded, Challenger has exploded, details to follow," which I thought was kind of grisly. Rushed to the office and spent, as some of you may recall, the next 7 hours on the air. I'm slightly puzzled by Challenger sociologically. I think one of the reasons it became such an enormous story in the country and had such an enormous impact on us all is because of television. Because we were all able to share that moment of crisis, that instantaneous millisecond explosion in which 7 American explorers disappeared. It was an interesting lesson for me in how you tie an enormous country like this together using modern communications. The memorial service for the astronauts in Houston was the second hardest day I ever spent on television, and was another great lesson for me in the power of the presidency, particularly a president such as Mr. Reagan, who clearly feels so intimately with people who've suffered. In terms of the investigation, which is almost over, the formal investigation led by former Secretary of State Bill Rogers, which I think is in Florida this week and will be again in Houston next week, has almost come to an end. I don't think we will hear in the final report anything that you haven't seen or read in bits or pieces along the way. There's been no real evidence to suggest, though they have not found it, that there's any other flaw except for the ring on the right solid rocket booster. The more basic question, which I think has shaken both NASA and anybody in the country who's interested in space, is whether or not NASA took risks for astronauts for granted. I give you, all of my answers are personal and not corporate. I give you a personal answer. I don't think NASA did or has ever had any real record of being anything other than very caring for human life. You will recall, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Right Stuff, recall very early in the program, astronauts, after considerable struggle, got a lot of power. And astronauts, among other things, were always terribly concerned with their own power and their own safety in the program. I don't know how far it'll set the program back. But when the final result is known, I think there will be in it a lot which says programs and procedures have to be much more carefully emphasized. There were, as we now know, engineers, Morton Thiokol, the people who build the solid rocket boosters, who told their superiors, who told NASA that they shouldn't launch on that day because the weather was too cold and the O-ring in the right solid rocket booster might be susceptible to cold weather. But I kind of think we know all that. I think we will come to the sort of written realization that NASA was feeling the competitive pressure, principally from the Ariane rocket, which is unmanned, launched by the French, to put commercial and military hardware into space. It will slow the program down. I have no doubt that it will continue. I was quite stunned, and I thought people, for example, at the time, on the day and the day after the disaster, people who questioned the value of American individuals in space. For a couple of days, the only person they wanted to send in space was a journalist. There's no doubt in my mind that Americans belong in space, just like Americans belonged on the covered wagons who went across the country and established towns and settlements and cities all across the country. But it'll slow the program down. The big question will be Graham-Rudman. In the short run, Graham-Rudman, as you know, is a major part of all of our lives, including yours, because you have a lot harder time getting funding for NTID this year, perhaps, than you had before Graham-Rudman came into action. It will affect the space program like it will affect everything else. But the President appears to be committed to it, and you heard him commit himself to a space station. So we'll see what happens. Yes, sir. You don't have to stand up, not for my case. Stand up, you make a journalist nervous. He thinks he's giving you too much respect. Okay.
What happened to Marcos? And why is he spending all that money? What is he doing now?
Everybody get the question? What is Marcos doing now? What's he doing spending all the money? Spending all the money now? He hasn't got any money to spend now. In fact, strange enough, he's living really very poorly. He lives in a house in Hawaii, which is, I think, estimated at $1.5 million. $1,4,990,000 went for the land, and $1 is for the house. Give you some contrast. He sleeps in a single room, in a single bed, with one table and one stand-up lamp. His wife, Mrs. Marcos, lives in the same fashion. Every time he goes somewhere in the world now to get his hands on some money, and I mean money in a sense to sustain himself at the moment, he finds that somebody's got there first and has frozen the bank account because they want to know where he got all the money. I'm inclined to think that he will stay in Hawaii for some period of time. Ted Koppel was talking the other night, having come back, that there's talk about a West African nation giving him political asylum. I'll give you a guess. I think he'd go back to the Philippines. I think at some point he will be allowed by the new government to go back to Ilocos Norte, that's hard to translate, to the northern province, which is his home. His mother, as you know, is very sick in the Philippines. And the reason I make such an outrageous suggestion is based on the telephone call that Marcos made to the radio station in the Philippines on Saturday, in which he asked people in the country to support Mrs. Aquino. I take this as an opening gun, if you will, in a campaign to get himself home. Mrs. Marcos is desperately shaken and sad. She can't talk for more than a few minutes without breaking into tears. And they are, as there have been in the past, Baby Duvalier, who is living in France at the moment, former men and women of great power who now wander the world. Some people would say that's exactly what they deserve. The gentleman behind you, Tim. Not only do I not think that what you describe as reverence, though I don't encounter much reverence in my mail, I think it's ludicrous. It is true that we live in a television society. It is true that there are actually four, including CNN, but there are three major commercial network newscasts every evening, which, if you add them up, represent the most watched broadcast in America on a daily basis. Having spent 26 years as a reporter before I got this present job, I hope I am wise enough to know that wisdom is about the most elusive thing there is. And I think if you've had any misguided occasion to watch my reporting over the years, you will realize that it is full of ifs, ands, wheres, buts, maybes, and perhapses, because I think you learn as you get older that with almost dramatic clarity that you don't have any answers, that you're fully entitled to opinions, and that you should, by and large, on your evening news broadcast, keep the opinions off the air. I am a little stunned when I read the polls